Want to build your career with CMI confidence? It all starts with the tools at your fingertips. CMI creates workplaces full of inspiring leaders. With its on-demand resources, network of mentors and industry-leading accreditations. Search CMI Confidence today.
This session is recorded and will be available on the CMI website and YouTube channel. Join the conversation by using the live chat box for your questions and comments. We'll answer as many as we can during the Q&A.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Applied Creative Innovation Transform Your Business, Retain Creativity digital event, hosted by the Institute of Consulting. So my name is Craig, and I'm an event coordinator here at CMI. Please join the conversation by using the live chat box, and we'll answer as many questions as we can during the Q&A. I'll now hand over to Charles Leon to begin today's event.
Good afternoon, everybody. So basically what we're going to look at today is something called applied innovation. I'll give you a bit of my background first, because the only reason I got into sort of creative thinking was basically because I was lazy. So at school, I would rather spend my time in the art room drawing and painting than studying. So I have to say, to the shock of my parents and my school, I dropped out of the idea of going to Oxford and ran off to art school. So I went to study theatre design, and that's become one of my great passions. I left college and started work at the National Theatre and the English National Opera, and that sort of gently led into working for film, which I absolutely loved. One of the greatest things about working in movies is that a team of talented people are brought together for a short time with just one objective in mind: to create something to the best of their talent that gives others pleasure. And that's a lesson that I've always sort of kept with me. From film, film is actually quite a difficult way of life. So I was lucky, and an ex-theatre designer approached me and asked me to join his company designing hotels. And I stayed with them for about 5 years and then set up my own design consultancy, designing hotels, and I retrained in architecture and in business administration, and we became a successful award-winning family of designers. Now, good design, and I would say all creativity, needs a good, safe environment. Creatives need to feel that they can fail, and although of course we never call it failure, it's like science. These are just experiments that teach something and help us to grow. And and help us to grow. So that lesson also has always stayed with me. So in parallel with my design work, I also began to lecture on the creative process and design thinking, speaking at international architectural and hotel conferences. And I joined Open Genius, or the Open Genius program, to give structure to my experience and to be able to share some of the lessons I'd learned over the years. Now, when COVID lockdown hit us, I started sketching my local area and posted these sketches on a local app. So my new audience pushed and encouraged me to do something with these sketches, which resulted in the first sketch journal book, which sold out in about 2 days. So one copy of the book landed on the desk of somebody at Kew Gardens, and they invited me to prepare a sketch journal for their fabulous sort of collection of buildings. And so the second book was born, and now I'm working on a book which should be out in about 2 weeks' time for Richmond upon Thames, and there's several more in the pipeline. I think that it's our creativity and our need to tell stories that has made humans such an incredibly successful species. Stories are basically how we communicate ideas. It's how we persuade others to follow us, how we persuade people to believe in us, to buy our products, to experience our ideas, to fall in love with us, maybe even to go to war, or sometimes even just to be entertained by us. So we are built for innovation. It's an evolutionary imperative. And unfortunately, I think a lot of the education and cultural systems often teach us to bury that natural creativity. So we are creative and storytelling animals, And to be honest, we just can't help ourselves. So personally, I've learned to use sketching as a sort of language. Sketching is just a skill. Anyone can do it. You just have to practice. That's all. It's nothing more. But creativity itself is an attitude. It's a way of approaching a problem and finding solutions. Sometimes it's enhanced by a skill. But creativity is basically asking questions, asking why, what if. It's exactly the same as what children do to find stuff out. So creativity is a quintessential human quality that, of course, we're all born with. It's making up rules, it's finding out where the limits are, and it's using our imagination sometimes to project ourselves into future scenarios. Creativity is, of course, the tool that we use to innovate, but also to survive and also to thrive. Now, we really shouldn't confuse creativity with innovation. So creativity, I'll give you a quick definition, is the use of imagination to cultivate new ideas born from existing knowledge and combined to form new neural pathways in the brain, leading to a personal original thought. Whereas innovation is the marriage of creative thinking and sound logic applied to the practical processes of implementing ideas and finding directions that yield a desired outcome. So applied innovation that we're here to talk about today is a process. It doesn't rely on just quick brainstorming sessions or posting a few post-it notes on a wall. It's not luck. It's a deliberate method. It's a structure, an attitude involved in generating new ideas. Now, structures enable creativity and innovation. And today we will look at how we can create the right environment to allow creativity to build and grow. Now, applied innovation, excuse me, is a process that can perhaps assess your thinking to identify where the risk areas are, understand the context of better thinking, gain clarity in a business problem or a challenge or an opportunity, generate multiple ideas for any kind of problem, and engage yourself in the creative process. It's combining tools and techniques for more powerful problem solving, letting go of fear and learn from mistakes and develop confidence in the quality of your solutions. It also helps to take on more helpful thinking habits, which is one of the first things we're going to look at. Then changing attitudes and beliefs, become more creative generally in your thinking, and embed a creative culture into an organization. Now, there are a few overriding principles applied to innovation and creative thinking. Firstly, curiosity. You have to engage your childish self to question why things are the way they are. And of course, doubt, and this quote from one of my great heroes, Richard Feynman, the scientist, you must question and challenge your assumptions and receive wisdom. So today, we'll look at metacognition, which is the process of thinking about thinking errors, what types of errors hold us back from thinking creatively. And then we'll look at the solution finder, which is a sort of 4-step process for applied innovation. If there's time at the end, we'll have a quick glance at some of the AI software which we use to support sort of all our creative endeavors. So thinking about thinking, our brains are actually wired for pattern. This may need a much deeper explanation, but they're wired this way says that we can operate mostly or most of the time on a sort of autopilot. So we group information into neural patterns and pathways so that we don't have to focus on everything everywhere all the time. Now, that can be incredibly useful if you want to drive a car, say on autopilot or automatically, and yet you still want to be able to react when a child steps in front of you and you need to hit the brakes very quickly. So automatic thinking and behavior are ideal for routine tasks because we don't have to waste any energy rethinking every single task. So whilst pre-programmed tasks save time and energy, they can also make us blind to opportunities because these patterns have become entrenched and very difficult to change. So we need to think about interrupting our habitual thinking patterns. I mean, I think most of you would think about your diet, you think about your fitness, you think about your appearance, but do you think about your thinking? Well, I guess most of you will probably say yes to the first three, and then possibly sometimes to the last. But you would have thought, surely it makes sense to manage your thinking as you would other areas of your life. So metacognition is the act of applying a strategy around your thinking that gets you to the result that you want. But first of all, of course, you need to understand what natural thinking errors and biases, and they are natural thinking errors and biases, keep you trapped in old habits and patterns. And for that, we have a tool we use a tool called the decision radar or the functional creativity test. Now, this tool consists of a series of multiple choice questions to assess your decision-making skills according to 5 basic factors that you can see up here. Understanding, which is the ability to define and understand a problem. Ideation, which is generating ideas that facilitate the formation of new ideas. And reasoning, the mental powers concerned with forming conclusions by using sound judgment and good sense by thinking about something logically, objectively, and sensibly. Then also analysis, the ability to sort, screen, and select the best alternative to provide a successful outcome based on defined criteria. And finally, direction is the ability to take a decision that's been made and deliver a successful outcome. Now, to do this test takes around about 20 minutes, and it'll evaluate these 5 factors. And from this, you'll be able to determine the strongest and the weakest areas of your thinking. But apart from that, it's quite good fun to do. We all love a little sort of quiz or multiple choice quiz. So the point of it is that our brains can be trained for better outcomes. So let's have a quick look at some of the thinking modes that can hold us back. Now, our brains naturally do things which sometimes hold us in corrupt and unhelpful thinking patterns. In his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman did an outstanding job of identifying many of our thinking biases, our faults, and the heuristics that we use. So broadly speaking, these fit into 3 main headings. Selective thinking, the tendency to validate certain ideas and discount others, that being things like favoring a pet idea. Reactive thinking, the tendency to react to existing influences, events, or ideas, often too quickly. And assumptive thinking, the tendency to accept a belief, a convention, or an idea as true. And often we do that without any proof, and usually based on experience or common knowledge or received knowledge. Now, whilst these types of thinking are useful tools in the right circumstances, at the wrong time, when you need to think expansively and generate new ideas, they can drastically hold you back. So selective thinking is, if there were one single aspect of human thinking that causes the most harm in brainstorming and decision making and ideation, that would be selective thinking. So when people come up with what they think is a great option or decision, what do? Well, they immediately look to justify it. We rarely seek to prove ourselves wrong, and we don't often go out to find disconfirming evidence. We seek out information and people that will support our position. We find supporters rather than detractors. And there are several types of selective thinking. There is selective attention, which is we see what we expect to see and what we are looking for. So to some extent, we don't see the world as it is. We see the world as we are. selective recall, in which we remember things that we want to remember them in the way that we want them remembered. And then, of course, there's selective observation, is that we accept information that supports or validates our position while ignoring all the counter arguments. So in effect, we count the hits and we ignore all the misses. This is often termed as confirmation bias. I think probably a very good example of this would be Henry Ford, who whilst producing his Model T Ford, or ignored the fact that cars can be more than just taking you from A to B and be black, that they can also be status symbols, that they can represent many other things. And he lost out massively on what was a complete monopoly on the market at the time. Now, we sometimes get stuck on a genius or a pet idea that we come up with during a brainstorming session, which we then cling to in the decision-making process. Now, clinging to our hunch makes it difficult to see other possibilities or possible solutions, and the creative process then ceases to be dynamic. We become imprisoned by our ideas. And the example of this, I guess, would be Kodak, who failed to see the potential of digital photography as opposed to analog photography. So quickly, I'm going to flash something up on the screen. If you can read it, it's difficult without feedback, but right. So just, whoops, sorry. Does it say, or did it say, I love Paris in the springtime? And again, without feedback, it's quite difficult to know. But what it actually says, and I'll show it again. Oops, sorry. Here we are. Is that I love Paris in the springtime. Now, the brain usually skips over the double the. What we see, basically what we expect to see, what our brains learn to see, and our brains tend to gloss over sometimes the detail. So our brains try to complete the pattern to its own satisfaction. Selective thinking often tips the balance more towards the avoidance of negative aspects or complicated aspects. So let's have a look at, okay, these should have come up separately, but it doesn't matter. A bat and a ball cost £1.10 in total, and the bat costs £1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? So I would guess most of you would immediately want to leap towards saying 10p for the ball. Well, actually, that's wrong, because the difference between £1 and 10p is 90 pence. The answer is, of course, £1 is 5 pence and £1 and 5 pence. And similarly, but you can see where I'm going with this now, in a lake, there's a patch of lily pads. Every day, the patch doubles in size. If it takes 48 days for the patch to cover the entire lake, how long will it take to fill half the lake? Now, I assume, it's difficult to tell, but I assume that most of you will have wanted to leap towards 24 days. Well, of course it's not, it's 47 days. So our brains love to make very quick and very dirty mental shortcuts. And this is for evolutionary survival reasons, because in evolutionary terms, a false negative is much, much safer than a false positive. Now, according to Daniel Kahneman, two cognitive systems drive thinking and making decisions. System 1 is fast, reactive, intuitive, and emotional. And system 2 is slower, more thoughtful, and methodical. System 1, of course, is our default option. And so all information ends up going there first. It's automatic, it's effortless, and it uses mental shortcuts, heuristics, and it approximates answers. It preempts and completes patterns. So if I were to say something like bread and, you would no doubt fill that in with butter or whatever. System 2, of course, is much more proactive and follows a more deductive and systematic problem-solving approach. It can deal with complex, abstract concepts, plan, consider, carefully review and revise, but it requires deliberate effort and operates one step at a time. So, of course, it's much, much slower. Now, whilst we might like to think that we are conscious and reasoning and system 2 people, the reality is that we are mostly system 1 because it handles far more actions than we care to admit. And we almost always trust our initial reactions and only every now and then bring in system 2 to review a decision. So we need reactive thinking, system 1, to act as our autopilot and to help us make quick and practical shortcuts. By thinking reactively, we conserve precious brain energy, and the brain uses approximately 20% of all our energy, which is massive. However, when we rush through tasks, we're not giving them the attention and the depth of thought that they may need. And this can be lethal to creativity. So we need to be proactive, not just reactive, in order to reach any sort of peak performance. And in reality, of course, we need both systems. Now, when we're bombarded with information, we feel pressurized to act on it immediately and to think reactively. What happens then? We make the wrong decisions, of course, because we haven't had time to think about the information rationally and objectively. So information overload also crushes our ability to generate ideas, and that's also related to stress. So as you go through your working day, every bit of information you come across presents you with a 3-pronged choice. Reply immediately, factor it into an imminent decision, or just ignore it entirely. So in a bid to keep up with all information that we're bombarded with, our brains instinctively go for the first option. So too much reliance on reactive thinking tips us into acting on an idea in the heat of the moment, and over-reliance on listening to customers, this cheats us into making reactive so-so sort of changes and improvements, and we miss out on designing breakthrough innovations. Most of the time, customers don't know what they want, and they won't know until we show them. So you have to watch out for the tendency to react instantly and automatically to information. So a quick decision isn't always the best. Assumptions. I'm going to move on to assumptions. Assumptions is quite a complex area, but we all have assumptions. They're absolutely everywhere in everything we do. We make them all the time in almost every situation, and they are basically our shortcuts. So an assumption is basically a belief, a convention, a habit, an idea that we accept as true, and often without proof. And we all have lots of them drilled into us over the course of a lifetime by our parents, our teachers, workplaces, and society in general. Now, our brains constantly look for ways to conserve energy. So we formulate assumptions, stereotypes, biases, partly because they're energy efficient for our brains. Now, sometimes our assumptions might be spot on, but they can also be our worst enemy. The danger comes, of course, when we blindly accept them. So assumptions lead us to think that we know more than we do, and this can be a really serious roadblock when we want to think creatively. In order to think creatively, we must step out of this bubble and into uncertainty. And as you can imagine, that involves risk. So assumptions do limit our perceptions and keep us retreading the same path of ideas. Innovation comes from doing things differently and not using just the rule of thumb. So how do we challenge assumptions? Well, first of all, of course, you have to recognize that you have an assumption in the first place, and you need to then use a conscious process or technique to help you unravel and change or challenge your assumptions. So there's a 3-step process for challenging assumptions. First of all, state the problem. Before you even start on your assumptions, we need to clearly state the problem you want to solve or the opportunity you want to crack. And that's absolutely crucial. Next, you map out your assumptions. Map out a list of all the assumptions, of the boundaries, the ground rules about the situation. This might be a stupidly obvious step, but how often do you make assumptions explicit in this way? See, you need to take a magnifying glass to your problem and examine all the different elements of it closely. So what might seem blindingly absolute and watertight that you wouldn't even think of questioning it? So then you have to challenge the assumptions and see if they're correct or if they can be done away with. So you have to ask questions to get to the bottom and trigger new lines of thought. For instance, what would happen if we deliberately broke this rule? Why do we do things this way? Why might this assumption be false? This is a very simple step, but it's actually incredibly illuminating. You never really realize how many unwarranted assumptions you have until you actually lay them out and confront them. And for that, you obviously need a specific problem, and then you need to work out which assumptions are related to that problem. So by questioning and re-examining our assumptions, we pick up a series of new perspectives on our challenge. And this fires us up to create more original ideas. But we have to be able to push past our usual boundaries, and I really do mean that you have to push past normal boundaries. So to think creatively, you must be able to look afresh at what we usually take for granted. So assumptions aren't facts, even though we pretend sometimes they are, and they can be very dangerous. So if you were to ask an accountant for a great idea, you'd probably get a solution based on numbers. If you ask a designer, you'll get a solution that involves visuals. So we are the product of our experience. And the danger is that when it's time to think creatively, we naturally impose limits on ourselves. And these limits are often based on assumptions and attitudes that we have due to our particular specialization or role. British philosopher Bertrand Russell has an amusing story. It's about a farmer and his turkey. So while living on the farm, the turkey noted that the farmer, of course, would greet him at sunrise every morning with a bucket of grain. And this led him to conclude, I'm always fed at sunrise. It therefore, of course, comes as a huge shock when on Christmas morning, instead of getting fed, he gets his throat cut. So the moral of the story is fairly straightforward, is that you can't deduct the truth from past experience. The history or the frequency of an event is not proof that it will continue in the future. The problem is that our brains strive for completeness, for closure, and for wholeness. So long-standing assumptions can keep you stuck on business as usual when you need to be thinking much, much bigger than that. I'd like to have a quick look at this grid. Let me know if you... Unfortunately, this was animated and doesn't work. I'll have to explain it. I apologize. The whole board is upside down to start with, and the object is to circle 4 numbers so that they add up into 12, which is impossible unless you rotate the board, make the 6s into 9s, and then you can circle 4 into 12. Sorry, but that's the way this presentation works through this system. So most companies pride themselves on being market driven. However, when the market drives you, you let the past make your decisions. However, or rather, how can you project a forward-looking vision if you're driving whilst looking backwards all the time? So selective and reactive thinking all result in being market driven, not market driving. And of course, market drivers are risk takers, and they surprise their customers. Taking charge of thinking errors leaves you better placed to deliver more creative and useful outcomes. How? Well, through a process that forces your brain to break out of its usual patterns. So creativity isn't just a one-off festival of wild thinking and experimentation. Creativity and innovation are an attitude and a process, not a singular event. So if you keep innovating as an individual, as a team, as an organization, I think you dramatically increase your chances of winning. So building a system around your creative practices is crucial so that you can continue making valuable advances and breaking boundaries in your field. Now, a good process makes your thinking mindful and deliberate and dramatically improving your ability to find robust and new opportunities. But your creative process must have enough structure to enable you and your team to progress ideas while remaining flexible. These are, of course, some of the world-changing ideas. Most of them sort of come through sketches or through writing. So we've looked briefly at thinking errors and biases. So how might we deal with some of them? And now let's look at the solution finder, which is based on 4 simple steps. And the aim is to help you create the right mindset and atmosphere to unleash the creative power of your team and to make the best decisions to drive your organization forward. So as I said, there are 4 steps in the solution finder. Step 1, which is understanding, which is defining the challenge, explore the issue thoroughly, try to understand what is causing the problems, and outline precisely what you need to deal with the help of the canvases that we use. Ideation is to generate ideas. It's not just brainstorming. It's the use of creative tools, creative thinking tools, to spark an abundance of ideas to address the problem or challenge. Then comes analysis, to evaluate all those ideas, to sort, to screen, to select the best ideas using a whole brain approach, and then making decisions. And direction, which is the implementation of the solution to strengthen, to improve, to refine your solution as far as it's possible, to gather acceptance and set your goals, and then create your plan of action to put the whole process into action. I just want to go on a very brief note about divergent and convergent thinking, which is something that we use a lot. Divergent thinking is an expansive and free-flowing activity that extends away from the original subject in all directions. It cracks the mind open and to consider all the possibilities and ideas with use of things like metaphor, dream, humor, emotions, visualization, play. Play is incredibly important. Imagination, of course. Fantasy, perhaps, intuition, analogy, hunch, random. Whereas convergent thinking is the mental activity that guides us to make correct and informed decisions. It enables us to examine how different concepts fit, focus our thoughts sharply on just the one single target. So convergent thinking, I think, is characterized by words like reason, logic, perhaps precision, consistency, facts, rational, exact, reality, direct, sequence, number, analysis, linear. So divergent thinking is generative, while convergent thinking is analytical and selective. And both types of thinking play a valuable role during the creative process, but only at the relevant stages. And there are 3 main phases in the development of new ideas. The generative, imaginative stage, we generate many options through brainstorming and many other techniques. It should be fun and creative stage where you can expand your mind and manipulate problems and play. You can test assumptions, break rules, think up tons of ideas. This phase is very divergent, and you allow your thoughts to expand and deviate. In the analytical practical stage, we analyze these options, gather information, converge to a single solution. And this involves whittling down feasible solutions and considering the practicalities, the costs, the resources, the timings. So this phase is convergent, and the idea is to force your thoughts to converge, to make them come together into a single point. And then finally, sort of selective action stage, where you build up, reinforce your chosen solution and begin to take it forward. And this involves generating recommendations, goal setting, testing the solutions, and preparing to carry it into action. Now, the only way to build your creative confidence is, of course, by doing and practicing. However, techniques by themselves are one part of it in order to spark more creative behavior, but you must also create the right environments and circumstances to allow people's inherent creative talent to emerge. So the creative tools are all user-friendly that we've developed anyway, have been chosen through experience, and their suitability to each stage depending on whether divergent or convergent thinking is required. So there's a wide menu of choices that we work with, and the tools match the particular problem and opportunity. Time to give you a few examples of some of the tools which are supported in our workshops and in the and they're supported also by, of course, the workshop leader. And these have all been developed with practical experience. So in the understanding phase, you have the define and understand canvas, which helps you to clearly define what the challenge or the problem is that you're approaching. And you'd be amazed at how often people don't define their problem clearly and head off in completely the wrong direction because they haven't actually sort of analyzed what the problem is. Something like what we call the 5 wife, 1 husband, which looks at the what, where, when, how, and why of the challenge that you're facing or the problem that you're trying to solve. And then there's the changing perspectives canvas, which I think is incredibly useful, because this is where you might take the role of someone you know or don't know, or someone you admire, and look at the problem from their point of view, from their perspective. So you step outside of yourself to some extent. You can't obviously step out of yourself completely. And you emulate the role of someone else, be it Einstein or Feynman or Boris Johnson or whoever you want. And we round up each session, of course, with checklists on the things that you should do, that you shouldn't do. And finally, there's we always have an understanding or a commitment form, which encourages ownership of that phase. So we then get on to the next stage, which is ideation, which is generative thinking. So stretching reality, unleashing wild ideas, if you like, connecting existing concepts in new ways, and building on other people's ideas. And this goes hand in hand with the techniques and the ideation toolkit. Now, brainstorming, I don't know if you know, but it was developed in 1953, or at least was further developed in 1953 by Alex Osborne, and has been used and abused very widely and quite often misunderstood. So a more modern view of brainstorming sets rules, assesses problems like groupthink and judgment, and creates an environment and a structure building from individual sessions to small group sessions, and then finally to entire group sessions. And there are also physical arrangements that need to be put in place. I'm a big fan of freewheeling, of mind mapping, and something that I do, and have done even with my children, is story sketching, which is just sort of freewheeling on sketched ideas. So some of the ideation toolkit here you can see in front of you. One is reverse brainstorming, which is glorious to mess around with, because here you come up with all your potential solutions and then think the exact opposite of what you're doing. Metaphoric thinking canvas. Now, metaphor, that I could do a whole seminar on metaphors, Metaphors are essential, not just for creative thinking, but in terms of how our brains work. It's highly important, highly associative, and it is one of the key factors within creative thinking. Then we have the combinational creativity, where you will get a stupid idea or a good idea and a stupid idea and try to see, or a wild idea, and see if the two can be married. But it is important to remain completely open to the process. And again, we come to the do's and don'ts, or the rules of engagement. And then with an ideation commitment at the end, says that people are invested into the ideas. Then just moving on, I won't dwell on these too much. There's analysis. There's, for instance, one of the canvases we use is the force field evaluation canvas, and the heart, head, pros, cons canvas, which forces people to look at, first of all, the emotion, to see what works, what doesn't work, and why it doesn't work, and why it might not work. And then again, do's, don'ts, and then a commitment at the end of it. And then finally into direction, where there's you can set SMART goals, and there's a formula, or a formula for setting this up and setting it out and laying it out, and then to build the solutions and build on the solutions from there, and then to evaluate all those solutions. Again, do's, don'ts, and traffic lights. This all needs a lot of guidance and a lot of input from the leader as well. There are many other forms. One that I like is this one, why we exist. I won't go into all the forms now. That if you want to engage with applied innovation, I'll be very happy to sort of go through the whole thing with you. Applied innovation is basically a tried and tested process for engendering creativity and logic towards problem solving. Hopefully this gives you a quick outline, and it really is a quick outline because it's a much more in-depth process. One of the things I want to point out, though, is that creative thinking is actually a source of joy, a source of happiness, can be incredibly rewarding, can be fun, excuse me, and can be very pleasurable as well. So you shouldn't lose sight and think that this is just a task that we have to go through, that we have to endure, and here we go, another brainstorming session. It shouldn't be like that. It's very important to develop a culture of pleasure, joy, and fun in developing and creating ideas. If you are interested and would like to, there is developed by Open Genius, AOA software, which I think is a fantastic tool for complementing and supporting any sort of ideation and any sort of problem solving tasks that you may have. It includes mind maps, task boards, Gantt charts, and they're all fully integrated. I think Craig will give you a link at the end of this, so that if you want to, it's free, so you might as well have a look at it. I think it's wonderful, and I use it all the time, particularly lately in planning out the whole program for my books. And finally, so I do lots of different things. I do the workshops for applied innovation. I do sketching workshops as well. I also do keynote speaking from time to time, and the AOA software link is there. I also write and illustrate books, as I mentioned. If you want to get a book, I'll be very happy, just in time for Christmas, of course. And that pretty much is where I'm going to sort of hand back to Craig now to manage the next part, if anybody has any questions or would like to ask anything. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charles. That was a really interesting presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And yes, now for the remainder of the session, we shall move on to any questions that any of you may have. And so the first question we have, let me just bring this up on screen. is, can anyone do this and benefit from it?
Right, so that's very easy to answer. I think thinking creatively is a skill. Think of it as a skill. It's not necessarily a talent. It's not necessarily an eccentricity. I teach quite a lot of sketching as well, or teach particularly architects who sort of now almost no longer use freehand sketching and go straight into computers. But sketching is a tool, and it's not just a tool, it's a language, but it's also a way of thinking. So as I said, I think right at the beginning is that creativity is basically an attitude to a process. So all you need to do is to learn what that attitude is and to apply that constantly, and you get better and better at it the more that you practice. So yes, this is for absolutely everybody. And in fact, I don't need to teach anybody how to do it. You know how to do it, but some of you may have forgotten or buried it a little bit because schools are not very good at teaching creativity. And I think, well, perhaps I better not get right on my hobby horse about education, which funnels people into, I think, the wrong things. So anyway, yes, it's absolutely for everybody. Sorry. Carry on.
Thank you so much. So the next question we have is, why does Charles associate uncertainty with creativity?
Right. So this goes back to the bubble diagram that I showed you. If you imagine that your whole being, your existence is sort of contained within a sort of bubble, then at the edge of that bubble is something that particularly someone like Stephen Johnson has termed the adjacent possible. And that's the point at which you begin to step out and away from certainty, which is all the normal selective thinking that you have creates within your brain, all the assumptions that you have. Once you step out of that, you're into unknown territory. So that then is where creativity happens. Now, it may be that you're associating two completely different things, but nevertheless, they will be within your range. This is why I think that you need to remain as open and as broad to as many influences as you possibly can and know how to harness those and to associate them. I think I mentioned before that association is incredibly important in how we sort of develop creativity, which is why I also love puns, by the way, but I won't use any today. But uncertainty is risky, and we don't like to move into risk. As I said, our brains are pattern-seeking missiles. They want to complete everything. We can't help ourselves. We have that one side of us that is desperate to complete something and to get confidence in sort of certainty. Creativity, for that matter, always steps outside that. Now, there's lots of different ways to look at what creativity is, but it is inevitably linked to risk and to uncertainty, because you have to step outside of what you already know. And that's why it's creative, or deemed as creative, I should say. Does that make sense?
Perfect. Thank you.
Good.
And so the next question we have, and I found this part particularly interesting. So please, can you explain more about pattern-seeking brains?
Okay, right. So the way our brains have evolved or are formulated or are wired is that we have this inevitable desire to seek patterns in things. Now, I mentioned also that there's an evolutionary imperative for this. Part of that is because if we see, let's say, a tiger come out the grass, and we see that happen repeatedly, and every time it does that, it eats someone or kills someone, then we have a pattern, a sequence of events that then means that we can predict the future. So it is partly about prediction. Now, that prediction then sort of unfolds itself into partly the reason why we tell stories. We tell stories because we want to be able to predict what will happen next. Now, we also use stories for influence and for all sorts of other reasons. But that sort of pattern seeking, that sequential need where we see event, 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 and then we string those together so that we can predict the future, is basically a survival mechanism. So I assume that our brains have evolved in order to make the best use of that. And as I said, it's much safer to have a false negative where you might be wrong. Maybe it wasn't a tiger, maybe it was just a pussycat who came out the grass, rather than the false positive where you might sort of assume the wrong thing, and there we come back to assumptions, and then you'll end up dead, eaten, or whatever could be worse than that. I don't know. So I think it's basically how we, and I think that's one of the drivers of creativity as well, is that we're constantly looking for a solution to the next step in the problem. So, you might wonder, why do we constantly sort of try to expand our exploration into space? Or and why do we constantly revise theories? Is because we keep questioning and therefore opening doubt, which then leaves an uncertainty, which we feel we have to fill. It's almost like a compulsion to fill an uncertain gap. I mean, we've all got it, not necessarily OCD, because that's the extreme example, but we all want to finish and have closure on things. The same with saying sort of bread and butter, is that if I only give you half, you will complete it. And you will complete it because you want to find the pattern and the sequence. Music is exactly the same. Of course, music is just sort of tone over time with spaces in between, and that's how we get music. And in one of the seminars that I give, I play at the beginning a piece of music from Strauss for Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and I don't allow the last sort of concluding chords to happen. And it's deeply, deeply dissatisfying. So we have this innate need for closure because it helps us survive. Does that answer the question? I hope
it does. Thank you so much. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
So I think what we shall do now is we'll ask one more pre-submitted question, and then we'll move on to some of the live questions.
Sure.
So the last pre-submitted question is it too risky to take on creative pursuits?
That depends on your aversion or desire for risk. Yeah, of course it's risky. It's always risky. You have to accept that not everything will succeed. But the problem is, if you don't take on that risk, then of course you can get left completely behind whilst others are developing themselves through risk. I don't think there's any way that anything can progress without some sort of risk. There's obviously consequential risks and there's less consequential risks, but in the development of any product, any sort of anything for that matter, it always involves just a little bit of risk and sometimes a lot of risk. So I think it is inevitably connected with creativity. The two are not, you can have risk without creativity, of course, but I don't think you can have creativity without risk.
Okay, thank you very much. So we'll now go on to some of the live questions that we have had through. So the first one is, what are the best ways to overcome cognitive biases in the decision-making process?
Right. Okay. So that, I think the best way to overcome cognitive biases is to, first of all, identify them. If you know what they are, you're in a better place to actually sort of be able to to deal with them. As I said, Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, is phenomenal in this, and he really, really deals with it. Thinking biases and the heuristics that we use are therefore, I assume, for an evolutionary reason, but let's say that they're there for a reason. They help us. They save mental energy, but sometimes they can stand in your way. And part of the reason that we have these sort of mental biases is also because they save mental energy. And one of the great sort of drivers, I think, of humankind is our need for homeostasis, to get back to a simple set of conditions. And that's why I think that you have cognitive biases, because they bring you back to safety. And again, we're back into safety, uncertainty, and risk. But you can't get rid of your biases, but you can become aware of them, and you can sort of work towards using them or not using them whenever you wish. But I would suggest reading Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. It's a phenomenal book. I mean, he won the Nobel Prize for it, so it must be pretty good.
Perfect, thank you.
Well,
and then the other question we have comes from Joel.
Yeah.
And so, do we need rules for a business to flourish?
That's a really interesting question. The answer would be, I think, yes, so long as they're the right kind of rules. But let me just qualify that a bit. I harbor a personal belief that you cannot be creative in any way, shape, or form, or productive, if you don't have constraints of some kind. If you say to children, go off and draw anything, then they'll say, well, I don't know what to draw. But if you give them some sort of definition, some sort of parameter, some sort of constraints, then they will become sort of creative, because they've got boundaries to push against. So I do think that, yes, you have to have rules and you have to have constraints. Question of whether they're the right rules. And I think it's also true to say that, particularly in business, that the rules change as the company changes. And companies change all the time, either by size or by their clients, or however it may be. I think change is the one thing that must be dealt with. So the answer is, I've forgotten what the answer is. I think I've answered it. Sorry, I lost my thread for a second there.
Perfect. Thank you, Charles. And I have seen a question come in asking if we will show the different canvases that you showed earlier in the slides. So there will be a post-event email that will be sent to all of our attendees who signed up to the event. So yes, you will receive that.
On the with regard to the canvases, my one sort of concern would be if you use them without knowing how to use them. So, but I'd be more than happy if people want to contact me directly. Be more than happy to sort of talk them through them and to send them some of the canvases, whichever they feel are useful. Okay.
Okay. So before we close, Charles, is there anything that you'd like to finish on?
Not really. Just get up and do it. Really, I think it is the biggest differentiator of all things. The one thing that changes the world is ideas. It also destroys it, of course, but fresh ideas are what we need all the time. There's never any shortage of them. You just have to sort of produce them. So, but thank you very, very much for hosting me today. It's been great. I hope it was helpful, instructive, and interesting.
Great. Thank you so much, Charles. So yes, that's it for today's session. Thank you to everyone who joined us online. And also thank you, Charles, for your insights and expertise. And so please stay tuned to hear more about CMI membership. Thank you again for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Don't forget, as a CMI member, you can find the latest management and leadership insights at managers.org.uk. If you're not yet a member, join our community to discover CMI Confidence with on-demand resources, our network of mentors, and industry-leading accreditations.